get us started. You'll see from the pop-up that we are recording this session. We love having as many people in person, but we know that life is busy, whether it's work or family or power outages or fires. People have a lot going on right now. So we hope you're all safe and healthy. We hope you and your families and your property are doing well. And we wish you all the best during these times. And we hope that this can provide some of an escape from the day-to-day and escape from reality, as we're so excited to introduce many of our incredible faculty, alumni, and parents to each other through CMC Connect, so virtual programming. We've missed you. We've been off for a few weeks as we regrouped and started the semester and supported our professors and our students as they started learning, and of course the parents with all their questions coming into this very unusual semester. As many of you likely know, we are virtual for this semester and for of course the first time ever. It's not what we want, it's not ideal, but we are making the best of it. Our professors are accessible around the clock. We're doing great engagement programming for all of our faculty, staff, and students, and of course our alumni and our parents as well. And we will continue to do that. We also are able in this virtual world to open up Athenaeum programming to our alumni and parents. So in our Sunday virtual engagement emails, we will include the relevant Ath programming for that week. So please do stay tuned for our emails. Make sure you protect alumni at cmc.edu and parents at cmc.edu from going into your spam or your trash automatically. And we will keep updating you with what's relevant both on the alumni and parent engagement side and also the Athenaeum and beyond. You'll notice in the chat feature, which you can open up by clicking a button at the bottom, it pops open to the right. Put your name, your class year, your city, state. It's fun to see where everyone is coming from. You can also open the participant feature and just see a list of all of the names of individuals. In that participant feature is also where you can virtually raise your hand. So after our presentation from Professor Camp, we will do Q&A, and you can either enter questions into the chat and I will read them on your behalf, or you can virtually raise your hand in the participant feature and I will unmute you, or you can unmute yourself and you can ask your question directly to Professor Camp. You might notice on Zoom, there are two different ways to view this. You can do speaker view or gallery view. If you're on speaker view, you pretty much just see me right now. If you're on gallery view, you see probably 10, 20, or 30 different alumni and parents and CMC staff. So it just depends on what you are looking for. We will not be sharing screen today. So it'll just be Professor Camp sharing his knowledge and expertise about mostly focused on the most recent book that he authored, but it'll be great to interact one-on-one and go back and forth. I did mention we're virtual at CMC. A big thank you to all of our supporters, all of our parents and alumni who participated in supporting the Student Emergency Fund, the Alumni Fund, the Parents Fund. We at CMC are so appreciative for all of the help, most importantly, all the help that directly impacts our students. So thank you for supporting our funds. We can't do all that we do without you. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Emeritus Rod Camp. For those of you that don't know, after 50 years of teaching, Professor Camp retired over the summer. It leaves a big hole in the government and IR program at CMC. I'm confident we will find someone unbelievably talented to fill his shoes. But of course, it won't be the same. Professor Camp, you have been such an important part of our institution for so long. And in fact, it is because of that, and I'm announcing it today, that the Alumni Association Board of Directors officially voted you in as an honorary member. So as soon as we can actually celebrate you in person, we will have you on campus at Alumni Weekend and make sure that you get the recognition that you deserve and the plaque and all the rights and privileges there too. So it's now my pleasure to turn over the reins of the conversation to Professor Emeritus Rod Camp. Professor Camp was the Emeritus Philip M. McKenna Professor of the Pacific Rim. His talk today is on whether democracy change is possible in Mexico. Professor Camp, thank you for being here, especially in retirement.
Oh, you're welcome, Evan. I'm delighted to be here. What I can see on the screen, I see a lot of familiar faces and names and former students, so really excited to be doing this with you. And I just want to stress that I want to limit my remarks so that we'll have plenty of time for you to ask questions, and particularly about what might be happening in Mexico in the last few months. So Mexico accomplished a milestone in achieving what democratic theorists consider to be an essential component of democracy, and more specifically, electoral democracy, with the electoral victory of an opposition party for the first time in 71 years, 20 years ago in 2000. Despite the fact that the same opposition party won a second election 6 years later, and then the former incumbent party returned to power in 2012, Mexicans' confidence in democratic governance has declined dramatically during the last 2 decades. So the fundamental question is why Mexico hasn't achieved what we would describe as a consolidated democracy, that is, a functioning democracy. Most analysts agree that it lacks a culture of law, it lacks transparency, and it lacks accountability. In addition to what we would consider to be those essential features of democratic governance in Mexico, several other qualities come to mind, such as leadership, particularly their level of bipartisanship and integrity, and most critically, the ability at all levels of government to actually implement legislation. And interestingly, only approximately 2/3 of Mexicans currently believe Mexico is a democracy. There are 3 interrelated components that are necessary, in my opinion, to truly understand the extraordinary outcome and importance of the most recent presidential election 2 years ago. First, they include the larger contextual setting of conditions in Mexico involving influential social, economic, and political variables. Second, to truly understand the most significant alterations in voting behavior and electoral outcomes, it is essential to analyze typical voting behavior and electoral outcomes. It is especially since 2000, especially in the last presidential election. Third, providing a foundation from those 2 perspectives allows us to determine why this outcome, as well as the significance of the 2018 presidential race. Despite some important initial achievements, Lopez Obrador's predecessor, President Peña Nieto, faced increasingly significant contextual challenges. Based on continuous surveys, a whopping 8 out of 10 Mexicans believed at the beginning of 2018, just 3 months before the election began, that the economy would get worse compared to 2/3 only 5 years previously. Half thought it was in crisis. Strikingly, from the citizens' point of view, the principal problems have remained the same in the last 18 years. And in fact, they've remained the same in the last 2 years, once again. More than half believe economic issues that are most important, which would include unemployment levels, the level of poverty, and the degree of economic growth, followed by security and crime. By November of 2017, 8 out of 10 Mexicans ranked the corruption of political leaders as well as crime as the 2 most important issues for the country, closely followed by cartel-related violence, increase in economic prices, and police corruption. At the beginning of 2018, President Peña Nieto's approval rating had declined to a paltry 27%, which is the lowest of any Mexican president since polls have been taken. Despite some policy changes in emphasis on criminal activity under Lopez Obrador, in 2019, some 1,600 cases of kidnapping were reported. But in the reality, the Census Bureau has reported that it's typically over 100,000 cases yearly in recent years. Furthermore, more than 20 million Mexicans were victims of crime in each of the last 2 years. Leading criminologists have asserted that more than 75% of Mexico's communities are actually penetrated by organized crime. So what are the security consequences for ordinary Mexicans? Well, the homicide rate this past year was 36,000 people, the highest yearly rate in recent history. The government reports that some 5,000 people disappeared last year. We don't know what's happened to them or where they are. Mexico is also the most dangerous country in the region for journalists. 104 journalists have been killed between 2000 and 2017, and 25 have also disappeared. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports 7 were killed just in the last year. The level of crime and violence against them has limited the function of the media as a political actor in promoting government accountability, which of course is essential to democratic governance. Most important, violence and crime have adversely affected levels of trust among ordinary Mexicans. As of last year, nearly half of all Mexicans reported that they don't even trust their fellow citizens. Support has grown dramatically, nearly half of all Mexicans, for police named by ordinary citizens rather than appointed by local governments. 1 year before the most recent presidential campaign, when citizens were asked which institutions were most powerful in Mexico, 4 out of 10 Mexicans chose organized crime, compared to only 1 out of 4, the president of Mexico. More than half of all Mexicans in 2018 reported paying bribes to police and or the judiciary. The broadest and deepest political consequences is that half of all Mexicans were strongly dissatisfied with democracy last year. Yet at the same time, 7 out of 10 gave Lopez Obrador positive ratings, and a majority still thought it was the best form of government. Satisfaction with democracy had reached its lowest level under Peña Nieto, but Lopez Obrador was able to increase the satisfaction level to close to half during 2019. On the other hand, even more revealing, 43% of Mexicans would be willing to replace democratic governance with military governance if it would actually reduce high levels of crime and or corruption. So let's consider the second component of our argument. Given the brief description of influential variables impacting Mexico's political context, how have voters behaved since 2000? And what have we learned in the 3 previous presidential elections? Prior to the 2018 election, Mexico briefly experienced a 4-party system: the National Action Party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, and the new party, Morena, which is Lopez Obrador's party, potentially had sufficient voter support to put them in the range of each other. The 4th party, the original Revolutionary Party, Democratic Revolutionary Party, the Ph.D., no longer belonged in that category because at best it only had a single-digit percentage of the vote in 2018. The winning figures for the last 3 presidential elections in Mexico were 43%, 36%, and 38%, respectively. In other words, no party had won a majority of the votes since 2000. Mexicans historically dislike political parties. Nevertheless, a huge percentage always voted for the same party. All 4 of these parties, shortly before the presidential campaign, had unfavorable ratings by half or more of the citizens. Morena, Lopez Obrador's party, and the National Action Party, PAN, had the same favorable ratings. The other 2 parties, the least favorable. Recently, repeat partisan voters have declined, but the PRI, Mexico's original dominant party, continued to benefit most from that voting group, typically boasting 20 to 25%, PAN with 15, 20%, and the PRD with less than 15%. And Morena had never run in a presidential election, so 2018 was its first time. If you required at least 35 to 40% of the vote to win the presidency prior to 2018, pre the original dominant party, in terms of actual numbers beyond their diehard voters, had the easiest path to victory. By 2016, however, only 13% of Mexicans had a positive view of political parties. The 2018 race also shares a similarity with the 2012 contest in that 2/5 of voters indicated several months before the campaign began that they would vote for this new party, Morena. Lopez Obrador was able to increase his support to 53% on election day. Lopez Obrador maintained his front-running status throughout the campaign, unlike his predecessor, Peña Nieto, whose support declined significantly from over 50% before the 2012 campaign to only 38% when he won the election. Lopez Obrador achieved the first simple majority in a presidential election since Ernesto Zedillo became president back in 1994. Even more remarkable, as late as 2012, many Mexicans, both Lopez Obrador supporters and non-supporters from 2006, were strongly disaffected with his unwillingness to accept the electoral outcome for years after the federal electoral court's decision. Indeed, the level of dissatisfaction with his behavior is reflected by the fact that only 15% of Mexicans in the 2012 race were even willing to admit that they had voted for Lopez Obrador. Fewer than half of those citizens who actually did vote for him in 2006. Second, in Mexico, when economic performance translates into higher standards of living, those who live in regions benefiting most economically have actually voted for the opposition, contrary to expectations. This pattern suggests the importance of political freedom and a democratic polity to many Mexicans who were recipients of higher incomes and a greater level of education. Contrary to popular opinions, this group of voters has been a key demographic in support of Lopez Obrador, both in 2012 and again in 2018. Third, in the past presidential elections, about 4/5 of Mexican voters about 2/5 of Mexican voters typically self-identified as what we would call independents at the beginning of the election, making them the single most important voting group. An analysis of prior elections reveals that beyond the repeat partisan voter, it is the candidate who truly determines his or her percentage of independent voters, as well as swing voters from other parties. The public's perception of their personality determines the ultimate outcome. Keep in mind that the election in Mexico, thankfully, is only a 90-day experience. In 2012, independent voters played a crucial role, accounting for 37% of the electorate, providing 2/5 of all the voters who cast their ballots for Mr. Lopez Obrador. Given their increased portion of the electorate in 2018, they played a major role in his victory, accounting for 2/5 of all Mexicans who voted. In this past election, we have a changing electoral scene. It is instructive to briefly compare the 2000 electoral victory of President Vicente Fox with that of Lopez Obrador 2 years ago, because both shared certain similarities related to voter attitudes toward change. Mexicans were not voting for Fox. They were not voting for the National Action Party, his party. They were not voting for substantive policy issues. They were voting for change, which was kept conceptualized pragmatically as an alteration in power, replacing incumbent politicians and the party they represented. Remember, they had been in power for 70 years with something different. Those voters who believed that Mexico was not a democracy at the time of the election largely voted for Fox because they believe a Fox victory would introduce a democratic government to Mexico. In 2018, change became a central issue. However, it was not about electoral democracy, but rather about the value of democratic governance, the alleged product of electoral democracy. Voters were fed up with the performance of the Mexican government generally and President Peña Nieto specifically. At the beginning of the 2018 election, nearly 8 out of 10 Mexicans disapproved of his performance. Voters were deeply interested in eliminating corruption, reducing criminal violence, and improving the economy. Voters most interested in combating poverty, which affects nearly half of the population today, strongly supported Lopez Obrador. He can also be credited with redefining demographic distributions for certain parties. He has always done poorly among women, but in this race, 52% of female voters voted for him. PRI has always done well among uneducated and primary educated voters, but he did twice as well among elementary school voters and half again as much with no education, and best among well-educated voters. He attracted over half of all age groups. He attracted half of the voters from the political center. And regardless of the policy issue, he performed extremely well, especially on corruption, poverty, and the economy. And he captured 3/4 of the 40% of voters who actually voted for change. A final point about the uniqueness of this election is that more Mexicans were interested in politics and enthusiastic about voting than any election in recent memory. 42% of Mexicans reported some or a great deal of interest in politics, compared to only 3 out of 10 during the same period in 2012. Furthermore, 1/4 of Mexican citizens reported being more enthusiastic about voting in this recent election, compared to only 13% in the previous presidential race. The increased level of interest may help explain why 2/5 of Mexicans in 2012 claimed they already knew who they would vote for before the actual election, compared to nearly 6 out of 10 in 2018. It also explains why 2/3 of registered voters participated in the 2018 election, the highest level since Fox's victory back in 2000, when 2/3 of voters also participated. The surge in voters turnout suggests that an increasing percentage of Mexicans are taking their civic responsibilities seriously. This intensity of voter interest explains to a great extent why Lopez Obrador's party alone could win an amazing 109 congressional districts, compared to PRI's paltry 6 seats, down from 156 districts just 3 years before that election. Despite the extraordinary victory of Lopez Obrador nationally, regionally, and locally, one fundamental issue which no government since 2000 has addressed, likely to link to the success of all policy issues now and after he took office, is ingrained pervasive corruption, which I would describe as both institutional and cultural. Mexico's future is not dependent on the passage of thoughtful, appropriate legislation. It is largely dependent on the ability of decision makers, administrators, and the general public to reinforce the implementation of those policies and behaviors. For example, the pervasive influence of corruption in the legal system, despite ongoing changes, results in a complete lack of respect for and trust in the judiciary. Indeed, 1 out of 5 Mexicans, the highest number in South America and Central America, believe paying a bribe is justified given the actual or perceived levels of corruption. In spite of the successes which can be attributed to electoral democracy itself, including many first-time achievements in this most recent election, there exist 3 challenges to functional as distinct from electoral democracy in Mexico. First, the major policy changes which have occurred to date are largely institutional alterations, a strategy which the US itself largely supports in its bilateral relationship with Mexico, illustrated by funding for legal training and revamping the Napoleonic legal system in an effort to improve the quality and responsiveness of the judicial process. But Mexico's more fundamental problems have to do with nearly intractable cultural patterns within institutional settings, which determine the actual effectiveness of those institutions, old or new. Second, all of the major changes ultimately impact on the legitimacy and the prestige of Mexico's democratic model. To increase the legitimacy of the democratic process or the model itself, you need to increase social trust in institutions, especially governmental institutions. Increased trust is largely based on the effectiveness of governance in providing solutions which personally affect individual citizens. Citizens who lack confidence in government institutions are more permissive of corruption. Fewer than half of Mexicans now believe that democracy is actually preferable to any other form of government, which is among the lowest responses in Latin America. Third and finally, all of the major obstacles to Mexico's path to greater economic growth, to the protection of civil rights, and to reducing criminal violence are intertwined. So the strategies designed to solve one issue must consider how it is linked to another issue. To the degree to which such strategic decisions are considered and implemented will determine Mexico's success in the long term and even influence its relationship with the United States. So I look forward to having an opportunity to talk to you and answer your questions.
Thank you, Professor Camp. We do have a few questions in the chat. To remind everyone to feel free to put questions in the chat or virtually raise your hand in the participant section, and you can direct your question to Professor Camp yourself. A couple things came in. The first is just a little bit more on the major differences between the political parties. You kind of outline kind of what each one stands for. Is it similar to the US in terms of Democratic versus Republican? If you could comment on that first.
Well, in the past, a lot of people would have likened the PRI as compared to the PAN being the National Action Party, being the more conservative party, and PRI being sort of a central to central left party. And then the PRD, well, actually, all of these parties, the PRD, the PAN, were both splinter parties originally from the PRI. When you had a dominant system from 1929 to 2000, over that 7-decade period, most new parties were begun by individuals who had left the PRI itself. But I think a lot of people were using these labels when they weren't entirely accurate. And I think it would be some misleading to try to draw exactly the same characteristics. And it's important to know that actually the majority of Mexicans considered themselves to be in the middle of slightly left when you do polling and you ask them questions about their ideological preferences. The newest party, Morena, is an amalgam of, again, multiple parties. supposedly on the progressive left, but really it's a much more idealistic party with all of these groups supporting an individual. It's a personalistic party, much more than an ideological party.
And someone asked about the percentage of actual voters. So of those that are eligible to vote, what percent do vote in Mexico? And then to a greater degree, is there a large percentage of Mexicans who aren't registered and aren't eligible for whatever reason?
I don't know what the percentage of Mexicans who are eligible who aren't registered, but the percentage of registered voters who actually vote has increased, not necessarily consistently, but gradually, so that you have somewhere between, typically now, between 50 and 60%, which is not a low. I mean, it sounds like a low level, but actually it's a pretty high level of participation, especially given the figure that I expressed to you, how currently, how people have little respect for political parties in the first place. One would expect it to actually be a lower turnout. One of the most notable changes in the recent elections is the fact that women have overtaken men in terms of total participation in the elections, first in state elections in 2015, and then again in this most recent election. So that is also a very important alteration in the distribution of voters, and therefore maybe candidates who recognize that shift would want to direct some of their appeals particularly to that audience.
Thank you. Two-part question. Part one is, will Lopez Obrador try to stay on as president in 2024? Followed up by, have there been any measurable improvements under Obrador when it comes to crime and corruption?
Let me answer the last question first. There was a recent poll that was done just the past week. And what is notable when you think of the overwhelming vote that he received in the 2018 campaign and took office, a huge majority of Mexicans supported his election. But this recent poll demonstrates that the percentage of Mexicans who think he's doing a really good job, as distinct with okay, and okay, that is, you would be included in the positive totals, but it's just, not an enthusiastic positive vote. That has changed dramatically. And that's important because it's that really core group that makes it possible for him to accomplish certain preferences that he has. It's also equally important to indicate to you that where Mexicans are most dissatisfied with him is with the level of corruption and with the level of criminal violence. Those two issues, his ratings are not in that positive category. They're in a negative category. As far as anybody ever running a second time, it's not going to happen to Lopez Obrador or anybody else. That's part of the constitutional heritage of no re-election, which millions of people died for in the Mexican Revolution of 1910. So even though we've had presidents in the past, it's been suggested they considered this, possibly among presidents Miguel Alemán, who was president from 1946 to 1952, and possibly even among Carlos Salinas, a more recent president. It's such a important concept that you wouldn't be able to accomplish it.
Someone's curious about your thoughts on a female president in Mexico or any other women running for a high-level elected office. Where do you think that falls?
I think it's actually quite probable, and it definitely is possible. It's not about winning the election as a female. This might surprise you. It's about getting the nomination. So if you can get the nomination of a well-established party, and a party that the party itself has the potential of winning a presidential election, Mexican voters, believe it or not, do not have significant prejudices towards women politicians. They've done quite well recently, and you're going to see greater numbers taking responsibility, such as presidents of the party itself, as well as presidential candidates. And there was a very interesting poll done a couple of years ago, which interestingly said that a female president would do a better job of developing respect for Mexico among other countries. So there's not a significant existing belief among voters, men included, that is prejudiced against having a female candidate win that office. And remember, we have a terrible record in terms of women in the legislative branch, whereas Mexico has an incredible, one of the highest ranking countries in the world in terms of the percentage of women who are in those legislative positions, both in their Senate and in their Chamber of Deputies.
A question about the ongoing Lozoya case. How do you think that case will impact the upcoming elections, or how do you think it will impact the upcoming elections?
Well, I think there's two parts to that. One is that there's a bizarre kind of position that Lopez Obrador has taken, saying he's not in favor of legislation which has been suggested, which would prosecute former presidents. I don't know if he's thinking that he might be in those same shoes a few years from now, or just he hasn't really given a good explanation as to why he's opposed to that, but it's a little bizarre, actually. And the other point I would make is that it only has an impact on the party that represents that president. And even though the person has suggested, the source has suggested that this may have gone on in the some other administrations, the primary focus of the accusations are on Peña Nieto's administration, which a lot of people already perceive to be corrupt. So it's not as if it's particularly surprising. It's just that now you have some hard evidence to suggest exactly what was going on. But that was already the reason why most people had a very low expectations and very low view of Peña Nieto's presidency and his character as president.
We had a series of claims against Obrador come through in the chat, and this person is asking if you comment on any of them, whether they're true, or whether you think that you view them as such, or if you view them differently. One is that Obrador's brother seemed to be seen on camera taking payments in cash, and Obrador defended him. Obrador shaking hands with El Chapo's mother, letting El Chapo sent out of jail, canceling the new airport for Mexico City, disallowing a new political party, and AMLO seemingly wanting to seek some kind of lifetime presidency. So those are kind of a lot of thoughts from one of our community members there, and your thoughts on those.
Well, as I said, I can't, even someone as sort of difficult to identify and to classify and to characterize as Lopez Obrador, as I suggested, I don't think even he would think he was able to continue in the presidency for another 6 years. What was the first one that you mentioned, even the first question that you had about?
His brother on camera taking payments in cash, and Obrador shaking hands with El Chapo's mother.
I don't know, really have a feeling about the brother and that incident, but the shaking hands with the mother of El Chapo doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, his personal behavior is unpredictable. And that's always been true. This is not something that developed because he became president. This is a quality that he's had throughout his political life. If you go back and see the way he behaved as president of the PRD, the original sort of left of center party in Mexico, which he eventually left because he couldn't dominate it. The thing to keep in mind about him, in spite of the fact that he fairly won this election in 2018, his history has been a history of not being enthusiastic about participatory politics within the PRD, which is the party. Originally, by the way, he was a member of PRI, which, as I said, was typical of many of the future leaders of the other party. So then he left that party and became a leader of the PRD, like a number of other prominent politicians. But like some of those politicians as well, he was never in favor of having a Democratic primary where he could become the candidate of the party, the PRD, for the presidency. That's why he essentially left that party and created his own party. He's a personality, which he has not actually supported in a significant way in the past democratic institutions. So to me, that's not surprising that he would be, less respectful of some of the behaviors that you would expect to be associated with electoral democracy.
We'll do one more question about Mexico itself, and then we'll jump to U.S.-Mexico relations. We had a question come through about Morena, which is the political party Obrador founded. It was founded in 2014, went mainstream in 2016, and won the presidency and both legislative chambers in 2018. Is this quick turnaround possible again? Also, are the legislators and local officials of Morena new politicians, or did they leave the parties they were in before?
It's very hard to predict what would happen, but as I say, whereas he was in a much more favorable position in terms of public opinion during the immediate period leading up to the electoral efforts in the 2018 presidential race, which he helped in that respect, all of the legislative seats that his party also won. And as the person suggested in the question, it was a combination of multiple smaller parties in addition to his brand new party. I think what's more important is how he's viewed now as we come up to those off-year, what we would consider congressional elections. And that decline in support, again, for the more intensive support, could have a very significant impact. So you can see, if you have one person who's creating this aura of appeal, it's great while he's having a positive, run. And that's helping all these other people, most people didn't even know who they were, probably had never even heard of them. As a student of Mexican politics, I had never heard of them. They weren't prominent figures. They were brought into those positions by his personal appeal. Well, if his personal appeal goes down, you're not going to have as easy a time doing this again. In other words, you're really, it becomes more and more detrimental when people evaluate the performance in this case as president, rather than evaluating the likelihood of the expectation that that performance will be positive and helpful. So especially because these issues, since 1994, the issues I mentioned in my brief conversation with you, those issues have never varied. at all. It's the same issues over and over and over again. And I think what's interesting to keep in mind, just one aside as an illustration of this, is some of you know my specialization in Mexican politics has been on leadership, not just politicians, but other groups of leaders. And in the last 2 or 3 years, I receive dozens of requests to share huge data sets that I've created on Mexican elites. And I really couldn't figure out why were people asking me. These were graduate students, people from many other countries, because they wanted to do comparative studies. And when I had started having conversations with people, then it became really clear to me. It's because the failure of democracy. So what people are saying, instead of analyzing the system, they want to analyze the leadership to see if it's the leadership's fault for the failures of democracy, rather than any inherent qualities in the democratic process itself. So it's why democracy is actually in a crisis, I think, even to some extent in our own country, as well as many other countries, but for different reasons. And I think that's become a real issue. So my point is, if he's making it about him, he's also indirectly making it about the lack of appropriate performance of the system itself in Mexico. And so it's really hard to disassociate the person, in this case Lopez Obrador, from the system, the democratic system itself.
So turning a little bit to U.S.-Mexico relations, you of course brought up democracy, and we have a few questions in the chat here about the Trump administration. How do you feel the Trump administration has impacted democracy in Mexico? Has the Trump administration's actions helped or hurt democracy in Mexico and the U.S. relationship with Mexico?
I don't think it's had much of any impact on democracy in Mexico. What it has damaged most in terms of our relationship is, for the first time that I'm aware of in recent history, that the attitude of the Mexican people towards President Trump, which has been really extremely negative, has impacted for the first time their attitudes about the United States. It may surprise people that previous surveys, serious surveys done by Council on Foreign Relations in Chicago and so on and so forth, demonstrate that Americans actually have a very positive impact of Mexicans, and Mexicans have a very positive impact on Americans. And when you ask very specific questions about it, you might be quite amazed by the answer. But President Trump, in terms of his behavior, has produced an outcome which has been transferred to the population rather than kept among the leadership or people that are, very sophisticated and well-educated about the relationship or have something to do with the relationship. So that is a dramatic change in the past. And hopefully we won't see it in the future, because ultimately, to me, the more important relationship is how we think about each other, rather than how, two presidential administrations think about themselves.
So we have a comment from someone in Mexico about this topic. Typically in modern history, we Mexicans have seen the US government as a promoter of democracy and liberty, defender of human rights, which has been a helping hand for Mexicans looking for such values many times against authoritarian governments. Now with Mr. Trump, it seems there is not such balance of power supporting Mexican liberty movements. Do you see this can change with Mr. Biden in case he wins the American elections?
Well, it obviously depends on your point of view about the performance of President Trump and how that performance would continue if he wins the election, or what would happen under Biden. But it's pretty apparent in terms of the policies which Mr. Biden is advocating that he would be likely to support comparable issues in Mexico, and not just in Mexico, but in terms of his international posture, in terms of who his Secretary of State would be and what those policies would be. I don't think that would be a surprise. And, I think you see that problem not only affecting how Mexico perceives this, but even how the European community perceives this and traditional allies of the United States. So this has become a very important, controversial aspect of the pattern that has occurred in the last couple of years. But it's not Mexico specific is what I'm arguing.
Question about all the illicit drugs and the weapons going back and forth between the countries, and of course related to organized crime. Do you think there is something important to be expected from a new government, like a Biden government, or do you think Trump would change any of his policies if reelected?
Well, I would doubt if he would change any of his policies if he was reelected. And if the opposition is elected in the United States, it's hard to say that all of a sudden you're going to see dramatic changes in all of those policies, the ones that sort of receive the most attention, whether it's immigration or illegal drugs, whatever that might be. A lot of these issues are very much ingrained, and if you don't eliminate the causes of those issues, you're going to have serious continuous problems. So the best example of this is actually illegal drugs. We're not going to eliminate illegal drugs as the largest consumer of illegal drugs in the world. We're the consuming element. So every place where you have criminal activity that involves drugs, in this particular case, they're ultimately going to have some relationship to the United States. It's an international activity. It's not just in Mexico. It's not just in Central America. It's not just in Asia. It's involving. Mexico just happens to be the easiest route to get the drugs in the United States. It's the demand for drugs. So unless we are serious about reducing consumption, and what's interesting is if you look from our own health and welfare statistics from the federal government, the demand for illegal drugs has remained unchanged year after year, decade after decade. It's astonishing. About 1 out of 10 Americans over the age of 12 have admitted to using illegal drugs. So what I always argue is, how often do you hear your congressperson saying, well, there's a drug consumption problem in my district, so let's focus resources on educating people, on helping people to eliminate that consumption. It's, you don't hear that because people don't want to identify problems, especially when they're in a national office representing that same geographic location. So I think it's not likely to produce a very significant change in the future. The other thing that's important about this is the ease with which people are getting illegal drugs across the border now leads to diversity in crime. So organized crime has taken over moving people instead of just moving drugs. And I think that's really important because it has increased the income of organized crime at a much lower risk. Transporting illegal individuals, not just from Mexico, but from other countries through Mexico, is a very lucrative activity. The other part of this is, here you had all of these drug cartels in different locations throughout Mexico, and then all of a sudden they realized, well, this is the most risky business, even though the returns can be extraordinary. Let's just do what the mafia did in Italy and then in the United States in the 40s and 50s. Let's just take over local criminal activities. So you see, that's what I say, when you see that 75% of Mexican communities have representatives of organized crime, and they are collecting incredible amounts of money through low-cost activities, of which one is kidnapping. That's why there's 100,000 cases, but only 1,000 or 2,000 are reported. Why? Because most police are involved in the actual kidnapping in conjunction with organized crime. So again, they're not that complicated to figure out, but it doesn't necessarily meet the eye to think, okay, well, the reason is something else. It's usually collusion with officials that can reduce these costs to criminals. They're actually very rational in terms of what they're trying to do. And that has totally changed the whole issue of illegal activity in Mexico. It's broadened it significantly.
This will be our last question. Thank you so much, Professor Camp. How has Obrador approached the handling of the pandemic? Has his response hurt his approval ratings, or are his supporters entrenched?
He hasn't done a very good job. It's his leadership in this has been very haphazard. And this is why Mexico has a serious problem. The highest incidence after the United States and Brazil and Mexico. And with a very high rate, extremely high rate of death among the medical community that is actually risking their lives because of inadequate protections. So you can look at, a number of issues. The one thing that I think is interesting is that apparently Mexican government and the Argentinian government and Carlos Slim, who's one of the wealthiest people in the world, have gotten together primarily with his support to produce or distribute, I should say, buy and distribute a vaccine from the Oxford group that's one of the leading institutions that's developing a vaccine, so that, I think their argument is by sharing this activity, they could do a much better job of helping people get a vaccine out there, rather than the kind of job they've done in terms of dealing with the spread of COVID-19. It has not been a very successful effort at all.
Thank you, Professor Camp, and thank you all for joining us today. Another congratulations to Professor Camp for becoming a member of the Alumni Association. We do record these sessions. They go on our virtual library. If you're curious in seeing what else we've had over the last few months, please go to cmc.edu/alumni and click on virtual library. So with that, we hope to see you at our upcoming programming. Tomorrow there is trivia at 5 p.m. With Ryan Buds, which should be very fun as students, staff, faculty, and alumni and parents face off against each other. We hope to see you there and at many of the other future programming that will be here this year. So thanks all, be safe, be well. I'm gonna unmute everyone if you want to, there you go. Bye everyone, go.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Hi, Tiffany.
Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Good.